Hey guys, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe pull that blanket up a little higher and just settle in. Tonight, we're going to spend a very long, very quiet time wandering through the drafty hallways of history. We're looking for the people who had every crown, every title, and every bit of gold imaginable, and yet they still managed to make life exceptionally complicated for themselves. Because, as we'll see, being a royal in the old days wasn't really about the palace or the power. It was mostly about being told exactly who you had to marry, usually a second cousin with a very similar chin, and then deciding to do something else entirely. So let's just relax and drift back into a world of bad decisions, secret weddings, and the absolute chaos that happens when a king decides he's actually a human being. Let's float over to 15th century England. Now, if you know anything about the Wars of the Roses, you know it was basically just a very long, very violent family reunion where everyone forgot to bring a potato salad and brought swords instead. In the middle of all this, we have Edward the Fourth. Now, Edward was, by all accounts, what people in the 1460s called a bit of a lad. He was tall, he was handsome, and he was remarkably good at winning battles, which was a nice change of pace for the House of York. But Edward had a problem. His main advisor, the Earl of Warwick, often called the Kingmaker because he had a bit of an ego, was busy trying to marry Edward off to a French princess. It made sense. You marry the French, you get an alliance, you stop the fighting, and everyone is happy. Well, everyone except Edward, because while Warwick was over in France doing the 15th century equivalent of swiping right on a portrait of Bonna of Savoy, Edward was busy getting married in a tiny secret ceremony to a woman named Elizabeth Woodville. Now, Elizabeth was not a princess. She wasn't even a foreign duchess. She was a widow, a commoner. Well, she was minor gentry, but in the eyes of the royal court, she might as well have been the woman who cleaned the stables. And to make matters worse for the gossips, she already had two kids from a previous marriage. She was a Lancastrian widow, meaning her late husband had fought against Edward. Imagine the scene. Warwick comes back from France all proud of himself, saying, "Good news, Edward! I've got you a French bride and a nice peace treaty." And Edward just kind of looks at his shoes and says, "Yeah, about that. I'm already married to a local widow, and her family is coming over for dinner. All 20 of them, and they all want jobs." It was a disaster. A quiet, polite, incredibly awkward disaster. Elizabeth Woodville was, by all accounts, incredibly beautiful, but she was also socially inconvenient. The court absolutely hated it. They called it a mesalliance, which is just a fancy French way of saying you ruined everything for a crush. But Edward didn't care. He was the king, and he decided that if he wanted to marry for love, he would. Of course, because this is history, love usually came with a side order of extreme political instability. The Woodville family, Elizabeth's siblings and parents, immediately flooded the court. They took all the best marriages, they took all the best titles, they were the social climbers of the century. And the old nobility, the ones who had been inbreeding comfortably for generations, were absolutely livid. Edward's marriage basically broke his relationship with Warwick. It's funny, really. You win a throne, you stabilize a kingdom, and then you lose your best friend because you didn't want to marry the French girl he picked out for you. Warwick eventually rebelled. Edward had to flee, then he came back, then there was more fighting. It was exhausting. All because Edward IV looked at a commoner and thought, yeah, she's the one. But let's drift a little further, because Edward and Elizabeth weren't the only ones. If we move forward a few centuries, we find ourselves in the 1700s, looking at King George III. Now, we usually remember George as the guy who lost America, or the guy who talked to trees when his mind started to slip. But before all that, George was a young man with a very specific problem: his family. The Hanoverians were not known for being particularly chill. They tended to hate their children, and their children tended to hate them back. It was a grand family tradition. King George III, however, was a bit different. He was actually quite pious and serious, but even he fell victim to the wrong kind of love. There's a long-standing legend, and I mean it's a very juicy, very persistent legend, that before George married Queen Charlotte, he secretly married a Quaker woman named Hannah Lightfoot. Now, the palace has spent about 200 years saying this never happened, but people love a good mystery. The story goes that George, while still a prince, saw Hannah in a shop, fell madly in love, and married her in a private ceremony. Think about that. The future King of England, the man who would eventually govern a massive empire, supposedly married a girl who lived in a linen draper shop. If it were true, it would have made his later marriage to Charlotte bigamous and his children illegitimate. It would have been the ultimate royal oops. Even if the Hannah Lightfoot story is just a tall tale, it highlights the crushing weight these royals lived under. Every heartthrob, every genuine emotional connection was a potential constitutional crisis. George eventually did what he was told and married Charlotte of Mecklenburg. To his credit, he was actually a very devoted husband. They had 15 children. 15! That is a lot of princes and princesses to find jobs for. And this is where it gets really interesting for our sleepy narrative. Because George III, having lived a very straight-laced life, decided he didn't want his brothers or his children making the mistake of marrying commoners or, heaven forbid, people they actually liked. So he pushed through the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. This act basically said that no descendant of George II could get married without the monarch's permission. It was the ultimate "I'm the boss of your heart" move. And of course, because life is ironic, almost every single one of his sons ignored it. Take George's son, the future George IV. He was the opposite of his father. He was flamboyant, he spent money like it was going out of style, and he had a very, very complicated love life. Before he was forced into a disastrous marriage with Caroline of Brunswick, a woman he literally recoiled from when they first met, he had already secretly married Maria Fitzherbert. Maria was a commoner, she was a widow, and, most importantly for 18th century England, she was Catholic. This was a triple threat of absolutely not for the British monarchy. If the marriage was legal, George would have lost his right to the throne. But they did it anyway. They had a secret ceremony in her drawing room. George IV lived a double life. He was officially the Prince of Wales, but in his heart, he was Maria's husband. Of course, he eventually ran out of money because buying gold-plated everything is expensive, and the government would only pay his debts if he married a proper princess. So he left Maria, married Caroline, hated her instantly, and spent the rest of his life being miserable. Because why settle for a happy life with a commoner when you can have a miserable life with a princess and a lot of debt? It's the royal way. Let's drift over to the continent now. Let's look at the Habsburgs. You can't talk about royal dysfunction without the Habsburgs. They were the champions of the keep it in the family strategy. Their family tree was less of a tree and more of a very tangled, very confusing hedge. But even among the Habsburgs, there were those who wanted out. We have to talk about Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Most people know him as the guy who got shot in Sarajevo and triggered World War I. But before he was a catalyst for global conflict, he was a man in love with Sophie Chotek. Sophie was a countess, which sounds fancy to us, but to the Emperor Franz Joseph, she was basically a peasant. In the rigid hierarchy of the Austro-Hungarian court, you had to be of equal birth to marry an archduke. Sophie didn't make the cut. The emperor was furious. He refused to allow the marriage for years, but Franz Ferdinand, who was famously stubborn, wouldn't back down. He eventually got permission, but only if it was a morganatic marriage. This meant Sophie would never be empress, and their children would never inherit the throne. At court functions, Sophie had to walk at the very back of the procession, behind all the minor archduchesses. She couldn't sit in the royal box at the theater. It was a life of constant, polite humiliation, and yet, by all accounts, they were incredibly happy. They stayed together, they had children, and they ignored the snickering of the court. There's something very quiet and sad about it. All that power, all those palaces, and the most rebellious thing you can do is just love someone who doesn't have the right number of ancestors. It makes you wonder about the people who didn't get caught. The secret letters hidden in floorboards, the midnight meetings in gardens, the sighs of relief when the king's advisor finally leaves the room. History is full of these little gaps, the moments where the official story of a royal marriage hides the actual story of a person just trying to find a bit of warmth in a very cold, very gold-plated world. As we move through these stories tonight, you'll notice a pattern. The more people tried to control who the royals loved, the more the royals found ways to break the rules. It was like a game of genetic and emotional Tetris, where the pieces never quite fit the way the ministers wanted them to. So, let's keep drifting. Let's look at the tragic, the weird, and the just plain awkward. Because the history of the world isn't just about battles and treaties. It's about people who were told they were gods, but who really just wanted to hold hands with someone who wasn't their cousin. So let's leave the rainy streets of London and the secret drawing rooms of the English princes behind. We're going to float across the Pyrenees and settle into the sun-drenched, yet strangely suffocating palaces of Spain. This is where the concept of keeping it in the family wasn't just a suggestion, it was an extreme sport. We're talking about the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty that decided that the best way to preserve their power was to ensure that their family tree never actually branched out. It just sort of looped back in on itself, like a piece of decorative lace that someone forgot to stop knitting. The Habsburgs had a motto: "Let others wage war, but thou, happy Austria, marry." And marry they did. They married their cousins, they married their nieces, they married their aunts. If you had a pulse and a Habsburg surname, you were probably on the guest list for a wedding with a relative. It was meant to keep the land and the titles under one roof, which sounds like a solid business strategy on paper, but biology has a funny way of filing a protest. Let's focus on the final boss of this genetic experiment, Charles II of Spain. Now, poor Charles is often the go-to example for what happens when you ignore the basic laws of nature for a few centuries. But before we get to the physical stuff, let's talk about the vibe of his court. It was a place of extreme, agonizingly slow etiquette. Everything was stiff, everything was formal. The king couldn't even eat a piece of fruit without a dozen noblemen watching him to make sure he did it royally. Charles was called El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. People at the time genuinely thought his problems were the result of a curse or some dark magic because they didn't quite have the vocabulary for recessive traits yet. It was easier to blame a sorcerer than to admit that marrying your niece was a bad move. Charles was the son of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. Mariana was Philip's niece, so Charles's mother was also his first cousin once removed, and his grandmother was also his aunt. If you're trying to map that out in your head right now, don't. It'll just keep you awake, and that's the opposite of what we're doing here. Charles was born in 1661, and from the moment he arrived, the royal physicians were concerned. He didn't learn to speak until he was 4. He couldn't walk until he was 8, and then there was the famous Habsburg jaw. It wasn't just a strong chin, it was a structural event. His lower jaw protruded so far that his upper and lower teeth couldn't meet. This meant he couldn't chew his food properly. He basically had to swallow everything whole, like a very regal, very tired snake. Because of this, he drooled a lot. Imagine being the most powerful man in the world, the ruler of a global empire where the sun never set, and you're just sitting there, struggling to keep your spit inside your mouth while a room full of dukes watches you with intense, silent judgment. It was a tragedy, wrapped in a gold-embroidered cloak. But Charles, despite being a biological disaster, was surprisingly gentle. He wasn't a tyrant, he was just there. He spent his days in a palace that felt more like a mausoleum, surrounded by people who were constantly checking his pulse to see if the throne was about to become vacant. The French were watching, the Austrians were watching. Everyone was waiting for the poor guy to keel over so they could start a war over his stuff. In an attempt to fix the situation, or at least provide an heir, the court decided Charles needed a Mary. They chose Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess who was, you guessed it, not thrilled about the arrangement. When she was told she had to marry the King of Spain, she reportedly wept for days. When she finally arrived in Madrid and saw Charles, it didn't get much better. But here's the weirdly sweet, slightly sad part. They actually got along. Charles was head over heels in love with her. He called her my life. He tried his best to be a good husband, but the physical reality of his condition made things difficult. They had no children. The court blamed Marie-Louise, of course, because it's always the woman's fault in the 17th century. They even sent in exorcists to see if they could drive out the demons that were clearly preventing a royal pregnancy. Marie-Louise eventually died young, probably of appendicitis, though at the time everyone whispered about poison. Charles was devastated. He spiraled into a deep depression, which in a Habsburg usually involved spending a lot of time looking at the coffins of his ancestors at the Escorial basement. They eventually married him off again to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Maria Anna was a much tougher character. She realized early on that there were no kids coming, so she spent her time exerting political power and fighting with Charles's mother. It was a household of pure, unadulterated tension, all centered around a man who just wanted to be left alone with his pet dogs. As Charles's health failed, the scenes in the palace became increasingly surreal. He was convinced he was cursed. He had the bones of saints brought to his bed. He even had the bodies of his ancestors exhumed so he could look at them, which is a very specific type of late-night activity that I wouldn't recommend. He was looking for answers, but all he found was more evidence of his family's long, slow decline. When he finally died in 1700, at the age of 38, the autopsy, which was recorded in horrifyingly dry detail, claimed he didn't have a single drop of blood in him, his heart was the size of a peppercorn, and his head was filled with water. Now, 17th century doctors were prone to a bit of poetic license, but the message was clear. The candle had simply burned out. There was nothing left to give. With his death, the Spanish Habsburg line ended. It didn't go out with a bang, it went out with a quiet, wet sigh. And the resulting War of Spanish Succession was basically just the rest of Europe fighting over the carcass of an empire that had been loved to death by its own family. It's a strange thing, isn't it? The idea that you can be so obsessed with the purity of your bloodline that you end up making it so pure it stops working entirely. The Habsburgs thought they were building a fortress, but they were actually just building a cage. Let's drift away from the Spanish court now. Let the heavy velvet curtains close and the smell of incense fade. We're going to move somewhere a bit cooler, perhaps a bit more northern, where the royal families were just as messy, but maybe with a bit more snow. So let's leave the dusty, sun-choked halls of Madrid behind. We're going to head north, traveling over the mountains and across the flat, gray plains of Europe until the air gets sharp and the ground begins to crunch underfoot. We're arriving in Imperial Russia. If the Spanish Habsburgs were a story of a slow, biological fading away, the Romanovs were more of a glittering, high-stakes drama that took place in palaces made of marble and ice, where the jewels were huge, the winter lasted for 6 months, and the anxiety was a permanent resident. The Romanovs had a way of making everything feel intense. It was a dynasty built on a scale that was almost hard to process. Everything was too big. The palaces had 1,000 rooms, the dinners had dozens of courses, and the emperors, the czars, were treated not just as kings, but literal icons on earth. But when you peel back the gold leaf and the heavy sable furs, you find a family that was in many ways just as fragile and isolated as poor Charles in Spain. Let's settle in with Nicholas II, the last of the lot. If you were to look at Nicholas in a photograph, you'd see a man who looked remarkably like his cousin, King George V of England. They actually used to swap uniforms for fun to see if people could tell them apart, which is the kind of low-stakes royal prank you can pull when you basically own half the world. Nicholas was soft-spoken, he loved his family, and he was quite possibly the least suited human being for the job of autocrat of all the Russias. He took the throne in 1894 after his father, Alexander III, died unexpectedly. Alexander had been a massive, bear-like man who could bend silver spoons with his bare hands, the kind of intimidating father figure who makes you feel like you'll never quite measure up. When Nicholas became Tsar, he reportedly cried and asked, "What is going to happen to me in all of Russia? I am not prepared to be a Tsar. I never wanted to become one." And honestly, you can't help but feel a little bad for him. It's like being handed the keys to a Boeing 747 when you've only ever ridden a bicycle, and then being told you have to fly it through a hurricane while everyone in the back is screaming for a sandwich. But of course, Nicholas didn't have to fly the plane alone. He had Alexandra. Now, Alexandra was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria because, as we've established, Victoria was basically the grandmother of every royal disaster in the early 20th century. Alexandra was German by birth, British by education, and intensely, almost pathologically shy. When she arrived in Russia, the people didn't see a graceful empress. They saw a cold, arrogant woman who hated their parties. In reality, she was just having a constant internal panic attack. But in the world of royalty, socially anxious is often misread as plotting to destroy the country. The couple was deeply, genuinely in love. They wrote letters to each other every day, full of pet names and domestic sweetness. In the middle of a collapsing empire, they were trying to live a quiet, Victorian family life. But history has a way of barging into your living room, no matter how thick the curtains are. The big problem, the one that would eventually haunt their every waking moment, was their son, Alexei. After 4 daughters, the birth of a male heir should have been a moment of total triumph. But Alexei was born with hemophilia, the royal malady. Because of the way royal families had been intermarrying for centuries, a genetic mutation had hitched a ride through the generations, and now it had landed in this little boy. In 1904, hemophilia was a death sentence. A simple bruise could lead to weeks of agonizing pain. A small cut could be fatal. And because Nicholas and Alexandra were obsessed with looking strong, they kept it a total secret. They lived in a state of permanent, quiet terror. Imagine the stress of watching your toddler play, knowing that a single trip or a tumble could end the dynasty. It turned the palace at Tsarskoye Selo into a gilded hospital. And this, of course, is how we get to Rasputin. Now, Rasputin is usually portrayed as this terrifying, magical monk with hypnotic eyes and a beard full of soup. But to Alexandra, he was just the only person who seemed to be able to stop her son's bleeding. Whether it was hypnosis, or just his calm presence slowing the boy's heart rate, or maybe he just told the doctors to stop giving the kid aspirin, which, fun fact, thins the blood, it worked.
So while the rest of Russia looked at the palace and saw a weird, unwashed Siberian peasant whispering in the empress's ear, Alexandra saw a literal saint. It was a PR nightmare. It was the ultimate read the room failure in historical history. The people were hungry, the war was going badly, and the royal family was hanging out with a man who claimed he could talk to God and also happened to be a legendary party animal. There's a quiet irony in the fact that the Romanovs were undone not just by revolution, but by their own desire for privacy and a normal life. They retreated into their own little world, drinking tea and reading books, while the world outside was setting itself on fire. They weren't villains in the traditional sense, they were just profoundly out of their depth. In the end, when the revolution finally came, Nicholas seemed almost relieved to put the burden down. There's a story that after he abdicated, he went back to his family and just went for a walk. He gardened, he chopped wood. For a few months, he was just Nicholas Romanov, and he seemed happier than he had been in years. Of course, we know how the story ends. The basement in Yekaterinburg, the quiet gray dawn, the end of 300 years of rule. It wasn't a grand operatic finale. It was a messy, tragic, and incredibly sad conclusion to a family that just couldn't keep up with the clock. But let's not linger too long in the cold. Let's drift back toward the center of Europe, toward the fussy, clockwork courts of the German princes, where the rules were even stricter and the children were even more overwhelmed by their own expectations. So let's leave the Siberian snows and the tragic silence of the Romanovs behind. We're going to head back toward the heart of Europe, to a place where order, discipline, and doing things properly were essentially the local religions. We're arriving in the German states, specifically Prussia and Bavaria. If the Romanovs were a story of gilded isolation, the German royals were a study of what happens when you try to turn children into perfect clockwork soldiers, only to find out that human beings are notoriously bad at being machines. Let's start with Prussia. Prussia was less of a country and more of an army that happened to own some land, and at the top of this army was the House of Hohenzollern. Now, the Hohenzollerns didn't really do cuddling. They did parades, they did regulations, they did boots that were polished so brightly you could see your own disappointed reflection in them. Think about Frederick the Great. Before he was the Great, he was just Frederick, a sensitive flute-playing kid who liked French poetry and philosophy. His father, Frederick William I, was known as the Soldier King. He was a man who obsessed with tall guys. He literally had a regiment called the Potsdam Giants, where he kidnapped tall men from all over Europe just to see them march in formation. This was the man in charge of raising a sensitive artist. The Soldier King hated Frederick's flute. He hated his books. He once famously beat Frederick with a cane in public because the boy had the audacity to wear gloves when it was cold, gloves being apparently too effeminate for a Prussian prince. It was a childhood of pure, rhythmic misery. It eventually got so bad that Frederick tried to run away to England with a close friend. They were caught, and the king, in a move that is genuinely some of the darkest parenting in history, forced Frederick to watch from his prison window as his friend was executed. After that, Frederick broke. He became the perfect Prussian. He won the battles, he expanded the borders, and he became a legend. But he lived his life in a state of quiet, intellectual loneliness, preferring the company of his greyhounds to any human being. He built a palace called Sans Souci, which means without cares, but you get the feeling he never quite managed to leave the cares behind. He just learned how to hide them behind a very rigid, very military posture. But if Prussia was too much reality, Bavaria was the opposite. Let's float south toward the Alps to meet the man who decided that being a king was basically just a very expensive LARP session. I'm talking about Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king. Ludwig was born into a world that was rapidly changing. The 19th century was the age of steam engines, factories, and boring parliaments. Ludwig hated all of it. He was tall, he was handsome, and he was deeply, profoundly obsessed with the Middle Ages and the operas of Ragnar Wagner. While other kings were worrying about tax reform or railway lines, Ludwig was busy building Neuschwanstein, the castle that eventually inspired the Disney one. He didn't build it for defense, he didn't build it for administration. He built it because he wanted to pretend he was a knight from a Wagnerian opera. He spent his nights wandering through his palaces, dressed in elaborate costumes, sometimes being rowed across underground lakes in a boat shaped like a giant swan. He was the ultimate theater kid with a national treasury. Of course, the government in Munich wasn't exactly thrilled. They saw the debt mounting and the king becoming more and more reclusive. Ludwig didn't like the city. He liked the mountains. He didn't like people. He liked moonlight. Eventually, he started sleeping all day and staying up all night, which is a relatable lifestyle choice, but slightly problematic when you're supposed to be signing state papers.
They eventually declared him insane, a diagnosis that was professionally delivered by doctors who hadn't actually examined him. They deposed him, and a few days later, he was found dead in a lake along with the doctor who had committed him. It was a mysterious, quiet end to a man who just wanted to live in a dream. There's a strange irony here. The Prussian royals were broken by too much discipline, and the Bavarian royals were broken by a total rejection of it. Both were trapped by the expectations of their bloodline. Whether you were being beaten for playing the flute or deposed for building a swan boat, the result was the same, a life that didn't really belong to you. It makes you think about all those royal nurseries across Europe. Small children in stiff lace collars being told they were the future of their nation, while they probably just wanted to go outside and play in the dirt. It's a lot of pressure for someone who hasn't mastered long division yet. Let's keep drifting. We've seen the secret lovers, the genetic dead ends, the frozen emperors, and the lonely dreamers. Now let's look at the ones who had to navigate the ultimate royal minefield, the quest for a perfect heir in a world where the odds were stacked against them. So let's leave the swan boats and the Prussian parade grounds behind. We're going to drift into a place that is perhaps the most uncomfortable room in any palace, the nursery. In the world of monarchy, children weren't really viewed as tiny humans with their own personalities. They were more like high-stakes insurance policies. You needed an heir and a spare, a phrase that sounds catchy until you realize it basically tells the second child that their entire purpose in life is to be a backup battery in case the first one fails. This created a very specific kind of psychological cook pressure. If you were the heir, you were smothered. If you were the spare, you were often just there, waiting for something terrible to happen to your brother so you could finally matter. It's a bit like being the second-string quarterback, except instead of a football game, you're waiting for a kingdom, and the only way you get to play is if the starter gets smallpox. Let's look at the British royals again, because they really turned the waiting room vibe into an art form. Specifically, let's talk about the children of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Now, Albert was a man who loved a plan. He was the 19th century version of a productivity influencer. He had a schedule for everything, and he applied this to his eldest son, Bertie, the future Edward VII. Bertie was a kid who just wanted to be liked. He was charming, he was social, and he was, unfortunately for him, not particularly interested in deep intellectual study. Albert's response to this was to double down on the books. He designed an educational program for Bertie that was essentially a 24/7 intellectual boot camp. No play, no friends, just constant grinding study. The result? Bertie rebelled in the most princely way possible. He became a professional socialite. He loved clothes, he loved gambling, and he loved the company of women who were definitely not his wife.
He spent nearly 60 years as the Prince of Wales, waiting for his mother to die. 60 years. Imagine being 60 years old and still having your mom tell you what to wear and complaining about your unfortunate lifestyle choices. Victoria didn't trust him with any real power. She wouldn't even let him see the state papers. So the man who was literally born to rule spent his entire adult life as a professional guest at house parties. It was a long, slow, velvet-lined existential crisis. But if Bertie was the frustrated heir, the spares of history often had it even weirder. Let's float back to France, to the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Louis had a younger brother named Philippe, the Duke of Orleans. Now, the French court had a bit of a trauma regarding younger brothers. A few generations earlier, younger brothers had a nasty habit of starting civil wars to try and snatch the crown. So the solution for Philippe was simple. They encouraged him to be as unkingly as possible. While Louis was being groomed to be the ultimate masculine symbol of the state, Philippe was encouraged to be, well, a bit of a dandy. He loved jewelry, he loved perfume, and he loved dressing in women's clothes at court balls. The court actually liked this because it meant he wasn't a threat. Philippe was actually a very brave and talented soldier, but every time he won a battle, Louis would get jealous and pull him back from the front. The message was clear. Be as fabulous as you want, Philippe, but you don't dare be competent. It's a strange way to live, being intentionally sidelined by your own family so you don't accidentally become too popular. And then we have the spares who actually ended up on the throne, usually with no training and a lot of confusion. Think of George VI, the father of Queen Elizabeth II. He was never supposed to be king. He was the shy, stuttering younger brother who just wanted to live a quiet life with his family and his dogs. But when his brother Edward, the Eighth, decided he'd rather marry Wallis Simpson than be king, George, or Bertie as the family called him, was shoved into the spotlight. He reportedly went to his mother and wept for an hour when he found out he had to be king. It's the ultimate be careful what you wish for moment, except he hadn't even wished for it. He had to overcome his stutter, lead his country through World War II, and deal with the crushing stress of a job he never wanted. It killed him young. This is the recurring theme of the royal family tree. It's a lottery where even the winners often feel like they've lost. You're either the heir, crushed by expectations, or the spare, floating in a vacuum of irrelevance until disaster strikes. So let the shadows in the room grow longer, and let the stories of these kings and queens fade into the background. They've had their time in the light, and now, like us, they've finally found a bit of quiet. The history books keep the dates and the battles, but the real story is always in the whispers, the secret marriages, and the long, lonely nights in the palace. Sleep well, and remember, no matter how messy your family tree might feel, at least you didn't have to marry your cousin to save a kingdom.